Hi, latest installment in my applied hashtag tip troubles in paradise methodology of creationism approach to various anti-evolution issues. Um, Got a little email from Tony Perkins of the Family Research Council, who I get their emails from, so they self-monitor. And typically he does stuff on culture camp items about gay marriage and the evils of the Obama administration and how wonderful the Trump administration is and everything is all sweetness and light now. Um, but this one hit the creationism venue, which he hadn't in quite a while. Andrew Snelling, the young Earth creationist, has apparently sued the Department of the Interior because he couldn't get a permit to pick up rocks there, apparently to do some study, which is trying to verify that the Earth is young. And this has become a cause celeb, at least at the Alliance Defense Fund, which is a conservative bunch that likes to weigh in on these legal matters. Now, as usual, Tony Perkins only gives one side of a case. So he linked to the ADF press release on the subject and harumphed at how poor Snelling was being persecuted for his religious faith, and that maybe under the new Trump administration that would be changing because people have a right to do their sound, wonderful science. Uh, Perkins is a young Earth creationist himself, and of course, Andrew Snelling is a young Earth creationist. And I was kind of curious to know what was a little more about it. So there's not a heck of a lot out at the moment, but I was able to find a little bit. The ADF conveniently put their complaint up so you can see what they presented. And there were just a handful of reportages on the subject. One from a Cincinnati Enquirer actually told both sides of the case. They interviewed some of the people who had been to the peer reviews. What apparently was the case that Snelling had to put a requisition as to why he was hunting up rocks. This is in the Grand Canyon. So you just don't wander around and pick up stuff just as a souvenir hunter. It has to be for some legitimate science purpose. And apparently the proposal that he was offering wasn't cutting the mustard with the peer review people. And I can imagine why, because Snelling is a young Earth creationist who's only collecting rocks because he wants to somehow prove that everything is young Earth. Um, the the other account that I found from a local Arizona paper only presented the ADF side of it. It was entirely a pro-Snelling piece. And I couldn't resist putting some commentary in on that at their website, where I pointed that out and thought, what's going on here? A source methods approach immediately wants to ground things in primary sources. So there would be two issues in this case. One is the law. Is it in fact irrelevant what you're doing the permit for, or do they have a legitimate science interest in this area? And if it's not a legitimate science interest in this area, then you don't get a permit. And the fact that you have a religious motivation for it is as irrelevant if somebody was poking around to do material to prove that the Grand Canyon is on a flat Earth. That would be something you would bear in mind. It's interesting reading the ADF's brief on the subject. They never once mention that Snelling is a young Earth creationist, only that he has a biblical perspective. They don't go into fiddly bit details about what proposal he was supposedly going to do this for, and whether or not Snelling has a track record of not paying attention to information fairly in his own presentations. I don't have to guess at this. I read Snelling's stuff. His material is available online. We know the material that he publishes in regular science journals, and he does. He's an actual geologist. But when he puts on his young Earth creationist hat, whoop, he's off the rails. He has a conclusion first, only pay attention to the data that supports it later, and only when convenient. One area that I had studied a while back had to do with radiometric dating, and I think I may have alluded to this before, but I'll give you a little brief coverage of it. That Snelling was insisting that you can radiocarbon date diamonds, and that therefore they're young. And he cited this particular paper by Salderon, who was using it as a way of calibrating radiometric radiocarbon dating tools. And it contained all the information you need to know that Snelling was misrepresenting the material. There was perfectly logical reason why you might get an 80 or 90,000 year old date on a radiocarbon buzz from stray cosmic rays generating carbon-14 in the atom, from carbon-13 being misread as carbon-14, the background hum of the instrument, all of that. And Snelling conveniently neglected to mention any of that. And later on, a young Earth creationist, Mike Riddle, was relying secondarily on Snelling without ever checking the original source. And I know that because I asked Riddle. He had never read the original paper. So Snelling's reliability as a technical analyst doesn't look good when you start looking at his young Earth creationist doctrines. Snelling also is aware enough of some data that there's tons of interbedded volcanic ash in the geologic column, and that's inexplicable from the flood geology point of view. What, did the spigot turn on and off suddenly? The planet dry out so you could have airborne ash fall down and then the flood happen again? So Snelling had kind of backed himself into a corner where he was suggesting there was more than one flood during the big flood. And that didn't set well with his young Earth creationist colleagues, and he's tended to back off since. Even as it is, the model that the creationists use for the Grand Canyon is that there's this kind of flood stuff coming from a kind of land dam that occurred after the big floods, and it drained kind of like Lake Missoula in the local Missoula floods that we've had here where I live. But that begs a question. If all of this is happening in only a period of like a few years, how do you turn the deposits in the Grand Canyon into rock so that the canyon can be formed when the water comes in afterwards to cut the canyon? Because if you've got this kind of undifferentiated slurry muck, it doesn't have time to turn into rock. And you're not going to get any canyon of any note, let alone one with these incised valleys that nest into one another, which is exactly what you expect to happen in an uplift situation. It's happening in other geological contexts. So I'm not terribly impressed with all of Snelling's geology, even though he's got a bloody geology degree, if you go to read his material. Now, this then is a quick summary of how you approach this from a methods direction and the flags that pop up. This is something to follow afterward. So I'll be keeping track of how the lawsuit works out. I'll be intrigued to find out what sort of case and discussion's done, whether or not if it's lost, whether Tony Perkins will ever call attention to it, whether the ADF will have a good or bad record here. The ACLJ and Jay Sekulo's bunch has only taken one anti-evolution case in their entire history, and they lost it miserably. I discussed that in my hashtag tip postings. And we need to see what happens later on. Will there be the case that this could become a lawsuit cause celeb if the lawsuit is lost and Perkins's bunch want to persuade Vice President Pence to weigh in and the courts and Trump? Who knows where this thing will go? But we should be paying attention to it. We should be noticing it and not waiting for shit to hit fan to find out about it later. We should be proactive on that. Well, anyway, that's how I approach a problem that pops on my lap from a methods approach. You can look at how you would be dealing with this from your own perspective and see whether or not a source methods thing is something that is a good idea to follow. Thank you very much.